you're happy, healthy, prosperous, and above all, doing good things. Your life is full of liberty and joy. Um, and if not, then I hope that you get to that state soon. Your life is full of liberty and joy, and you're doing good things. Um, so, what is happening with Assad and Syria? Well, people who are monitoring the situation will note that the Syrian Christians are in a state of um, trepidation, anxiety, fear, because now that the Assad regime is overthrown, Assad was an Alawite, and now that the Assad regime, he was a secular Alawite, but he was an Alawite culturally, and now that their regime has been overthrown, the question is what will happen to the Christians in Syria. There is a very old Christian presence in Syria since basically the birth of Christianity. Damascus was obviously a very important city in the Christian religion in the New Testament, obviously. And it is a very, a very old population in terms of they have been there for millennia and have a very rich tradition and culture there. Now that the Alawites have been overthrown and an Islamist group has taken over, you're hearing a lot of demonstrably falsifiable claims. Right? The rebels are a mishmash that were somehow organized over the last several years because of funding from the United States and Israel. And that, there are rebels who are secular and rebels who are Marxist and rebels who are, religious and extremists and all this other stuff. But it's like a hodgepodge of rebels, and the U.S. just wanted Assad out. And there's accusations that this was all a plan just to destabilize the Middle East and make it harder for the incoming President Trump to have a harder time, a more unstable situation. First of all, what's stable situation? The Middle East has not been stable for a long time. And saying that Syria was an agent of stability, sorry, but they've been having a civil war. And, it has not been a unified country since 2011. Right. And so to suggest that somehow this is more unstable than before. No, it's unstable, yes, but not more unstable than before, necessarily. And anyway, the suggestion has been made by many that many who don't really know what's going on, or many who think they know what's going on, but maybe misreading the map a little or a lot, that the U.S. has been funding and training these rebels, and that Israel has been providing humanitarian assistance to them, including sending like medical supplies to them openly. And, Israel's been doing that apparently for years, according to, the people that say this kind of thing. Notably, the people that tend to say this are folks that happen to be also repeating the line marched out by Russian propagandists that they want things to return to the status quo ante. Right? They want things to go back to the way they were before Assad was ousted. Yeah, sure they do. They want the Russians in control of Syria. Russians and Iran have been controlling Syria for a long time, in the sense of propping up the dictator with Russian support from its military and obviously Iranian support as well, and Iran's support extended into Hezbollah supporting Syria, of course. So basically, a bunch of very bad actors were supporting Assad for a very long time. But that doesn't mean that the new incoming HTS group is necessarily better. Like I said before, like replacing one dictator with another isn't necessarily going to be good for the people. And if you're a Christian Syrian right now, or any other minority that isn't of that particular sect of Islam, you have to be worried if you're living in Syria, because there are people who will very likely be harmed in horrible ways, rape, torture, kill, whatever, all that stuff, and many of them will probably be sold into slavery, many as sex slaves, many as other kind of slaves, just like the Yazidi women were when the Islamic State in Iraq took over and established what they called their Islamic State Caliphate, which was then pretty quickly overrun by forces against it. But they were there for some years, and in those years they did horrible, 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 unspeakable acts to countless men, women, and children, especially the women and girls. Some of whom, by the way, one of them was released, if you remember, was freed by the IDF some months ago when they discovered her in Gaza, where she had been held for about a dozen years against her will, because she was forced into marriage, she was forced into being married to this guy from Gaza. She was a Yazidi who had been sold basically as a sex slave. He basically bought her for the purpose of marrying a child, which he did. And then he kept her basically as a prisoner, his wife, so to speak. But she was not free to travel. She was not free to go home to see her family. She was a prisoner, a sex slave, basically. And there are many people right now in Syria, I'm sure, Alawites included, who are fearful of what this new regime might do. And they have every reason to be fearful of it, because the people that are taking over are not exactly, how do I put that? They're not exactly famous for being kind and sympathetic to people that are not of their particular view when it comes to religion, right? Like, it's a group that used to be affiliated very directly with Al-Qaeda and with the Islamic State movements. And, you could say, well, Iran doesn't like them, and they're fighting against Iran. Listen, just because Iran doesn't like them, first of all, doesn't mean that they're actually not supporting them in any way. They may not like them, but they still could be supporting them. Like, you forget, like, Palestinians in Gaza got a lot of support from Iran, and especially like Hamas, obviously. And Hamas are Sunni Arabs, right? Well, the Persians of Iran, who are Muslim, are of the Shia belief, right? They're not Sunni. And Sunnis and Shia have obviously fought a lot over the centuries, but sometimes they're allies when they have a common enemy, and sometimes they're enemies when they have no one else to fight, right? So it all depends on who they're fighting at the time, I guess. And in this case, yeah, of course it's obvious that Iran would prefer Assad to stay in power, but that doesn't mean that chess the nation that fathered the game of chess, supposedly, Iran, Persia, isn't capable of seeing a longer term strategy than that. It's not like they didn't know that the Assad regime would eventually change because no one stays in power forever. They figured he's going to leave the scene at some point, and then what? Right? If his children wouldn't take over, and then how would he, how would Syria anyway go on? I mean, maybe his children would have taken over. Who knows? Maybe one of his kids would have become the next dictator, but, there was obviously strategy going on about figuring out what to do in case Syria falls. Because you can say a lot of things about Iran, that their government is theocratic, and that they're oppressive, and that they're brutal, and that they're not humanitarian, that they're misogynist, and all this stuff, but don't tell me they're not politically astute. Right? They know how to read the map. The fact that they might read it very differently than you or I, come to different conclusions than you or I, and they may believe very, very different things than you or I, doesn't mean that they're not politically astute when it comes to comprehending political strategy, right? Now, they may be misreading the map, but they're able to read it and just misinterpret it. And that, I would say, is something that is true to actually most people. Most people can probably read the map and misinterpret it. Most people who bother to learn anything about geopolitics, obviously. And obviously political leaders in any nation, have their advisors who are politically astute, even if the leaders aren't necessarily so much. But in the case of Iran, they absolutely are. Sorry, gardening here. Sorry about that. I was walking by some gardening happening, early morning gardening. So the question is it going to be good for Israel or the United States or even Syria? Really, most importantly, because this is happening in Syria. This is affecting the millions of people living in Syria and the millions of Syrians living outside of Syria and the nations in which they live and the nations that have relationships with Syria. How is this going to impact that country? Because this is much bigger than just removing a guy who was running the country. Right? If their entire system of government changes, if their relationships with countries radically changes, if their trade relations change, if their cultural relations change, all these things matter. By the way, there have been calls already by some rebels telling Israel, like rebels in Syria, who are anti-Assad forces, obviously, telling Israel to support it against Assad. So there is, certainly information that says, the rebels would like to have Israel's support. And why would they do that? Well, because they want to win the kinetic fight against Assad, and they don't want to engage in a fight with Israel, because although they may have the ability to overthrow the Assad regime, it doesn't necessarily mean, in fact, it definitely does not mean that they have the kinetic ability to attack Israel with any great success. And so, seeing that happening is not a surprise. It is, in fact, the opposite of one. Right? I'm talking about a small ragtag band, relatively small ragtag band of disparate groups that unified to form a slightly more capable, slightly more disciplined kind of army or militia or whatever you want to call it, that's able to take orders and fight with some kind of military strategy and not just be like chaos everywhere. But Again, if this group has really not mollified its ways from the leadership down, which is led by an Islamist group, doesn't matter if there are secular groups within it, its leader overall is an Islamist, that does not bode well for peace and prosperity in the region. And it doesn't matter who's behind helping these guys to achieve what they've done. It doesn't matter if the US or Israel or Turkey funded them, aided them, whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is there going to be, greater stability and prosperity? And the answer, honestly, is really just time will tell, which of course is a lame answer, but it's a lame situation, and there really is no other answer, because nobody can know right now, especially given the way that the rebels have addressed the issue. Nobody can really know how they're going to behave. Right? Nobody can know what they are going to do. So, anyway, honestly, hoping for the best and really praying for the safety of everybody in the country. Because even though, yes, I'm here in northern Israel, doesn't mean I want to see human suffering anywhere. I definitely don't. And am I glad that a brutal dictator like Assad is out of power? Yeah, absolutely, I'm glad. The guy was an awful monster. But am I thrilled to see who's taken over? Not yet, I'm not. And probably won't be. Right? That's just the reality of what it's probably going to be like for a while. We're just going to have a lot of not knowing, lack of clarity. And once there's more clarity, then we'll be able to see and have a better idea